This is episode number 5 of the series Decolonizing Design Through Dialogue. This series is possible thanks to the Design History Society, which awarded me the Decolonial Design History Grant. They also advised me on whom to interview outside of Latin America so that this series could have a more international perspective. This series features interviews and projects from India, Argentina, Spain, Ghana, the USA, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Australia, Ecuador, and Paraguay. It is a trilingual series with episodes in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. I interview designers, artists, and design researchers. Daniel Huppatz is a professor of design theory and history in Australia. In this interview, he tells us about his work researching Asian design. He also tells about how to include Indigenous knowledge in the design curricula. My name is Mariana Salgado. This is Diseño y Diáspora.
Thanks for having me. My name's Dan Huppatz. I teach design history and theory at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking with you today.
And what did you study?
What did I study? It was quite some time ago. I studied originally, I did humanities. So I did a humanities majoring in English, art history and philosophy at the ANU in Canberra. And then I did a master's in critical theory, which was quite popular at that time, and cultural studies and that sort of thing. And then I did a PhD and my focus was looking at design in Hong Kong.
Wow. Quite a shift. What brought you to design in Hong Kong?
Well, I was interested in the issues around colonization and, what that might mean for cultural production. And I was teaching at the time, I was teaching some design history units, and I thought it would be good to focus on design and the sort of more recent history of design in Hong Kong. Because it was an English-speaking colony, and I can speak a few words of Chinese, but not properly. So I figured there would be material in English, and I would be able to interview and talk to designers and architects in English. So I was looking at the period in the lead up to the handover, what was called the handover in 1997.
And what did you find out?
Well, I guess what was interesting is Hong Kong is nowadays people simply think of it as part of China, but at that time, even in the 1990s, it was still very much a British colony. And so I guess I was interested in the effects of that on the design industry in Hong Kong. And the effects were, there seemed to be sort of two main ways of thinking about design. There was sort of the British Western way of thinking about design, and then there was a more Chinese influenced way of thinking about design. This is in the 1990s, which came through very much, say, in I was looking at a lot of graphics and communication design and packaging and that sort of thing.
Okay. So how would you define the concept of decolonial design?
It's a big question.
Yes.
I think decolonization, to start with that and that side of the equation, it's really got to do with the undoing of colonial institutions, colonial practices, and colonial ways of thinking. So that's the decolonizing part of it. So in terms of design practice, I guess, it's the acknowledgement that so much of what happens in design education and design practice and design theories are based on European ways of thinking about design. And assumptions and worldviews and that sort of thing. So it's a question then of sort of undoing that way of thinking and opening up to particularly Indigenous ways of thinking, but also, other cultures, other, ways of thinking about design and thinking about being in the world.
So how your practice as an educator is influenced by all of that, right?
Yes, it has been. Yeah. So following the PhD, I started teaching a course about modernism in Asia and what that might mean, what modern design in an Asian context might mean. And that was the title then of my first book, Modern Asian Design, whereby I guess it had come out of teaching, can we rethink the history of design without always going back to Europe as the center of things?
So in the book, you talk about Shanghai designers, the ones appropriating design and improving it, no? And you describe the design as this design as community-based with even a bandit character. What does it mean for a designer to be a Shanghai designer?
This is the Shanzai idea, whereby they were the sort of pirates.
I pronounce it wrongly, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
No. Yeah, whereby this was particularly to do with the electronics industry and, mobile phones and personal electronics and that sort of thing, all being produced in the south of China. And so some entrepreneurial designers, particularly in late 20th century, early 2000s, I guess, started, working with these factories where things like iPhones and smartphones and things are made, and modifying them and changing them and adapting them in, I guess, ways that would be considered, illegal, if you will, if from what Apple would like them to do, or Samsung or whoever. But yeah, looking at, I guess, hacking the designs to create different modifications that might be better suited for individuals.
But this type of practice of hacking a design that is very well known, and in most of the cases, they were still using their brands, right? It's a kind of
yes.
activism, or would you define it as a kind of activism?
In that particular Chinese context, no, it was less an activism and more in terms of, what can we do with this technology that might make it more useful for people on the streets? So if somebody, for example, was, I don't know, let's say, vision impaired, can we change the screen resolution and modify the case itself to make it more easy to use for someone in that situation?
And did you realize this, if ever some of these features were taken back by the big corporation producing these phones and these technologies?
Yeah, look, they don't like that type of thing.
Okay.
No, because then, yes, the intellectual property rights and all of that sort of thing come into it. And companies like Apple are always, having lawsuits to try and defend their intellectual property all over the place. So, yes, they don't appreciate that type of design.
So which are the things that have had an impact from Asian modern design?
The type of thing that I was looking at, I guess, were things that had developed in an Asian context that weren't simply copying what was happening in Europe or the United States. Because there has been this long-standing sort of trajectory or understanding of design as originating in England in the Industrial Revolution, wrong revolution, industrial revolution. And then, the rest of the world sort of copies from there. And then, what's happening at the Bauhaus, and then everybody copies from there. So I guess I was looking at a sort of framework. Can we rethink the history of design that does not center on Europe, that decenters that, and that acknowledges practices that are happening in Asia and were happening for a long time? For example, the porcelain industry in China, which was a very sophisticated industry where they're mass producing porcelain objects for a global market and adjusting it for the market. This is right back in the 17th century, 18th century, and also the Indian textile market. Similarly, mass production. Now, they're not mass producing things with machines, but they're mass producing them and adopting them to different markets and that sort of thing. And as for more modern ideas, perhaps the best example, I think, is a rice cooker.
Yes.
As just an everyday design object.
What is a rice cooker?
Rice cooker.
Yeah.
That cooks rice.
Okay.
It's simply a device for your kitchen. Now, these things are very much electric rice cooker, very much a standard object in every kitchen across much of Asia. And I guess this is an object which was very much developed for Asian markets, in Japan. But then they found they needed to modify these cookers for the Hong Kong market. And then some of the companies expanded to the Middle East, where they use a slightly different type of rice. And so, they needed to, again, adopt to the local context.
Well, nowadays, there is a lot of families in Europe that have a rice cooker.
Right. Yeah. So it's becoming standard, I guess, all over the place.
But what has happened with the porcelain? Because the porcelain, I mean, we, of course, admired the Chinese porcelain, but it's not something that came here, or not widely.
To Europe?
Yeah.
Well, it did. There was a great export market to Europe, and there was a long history of European producers trying to make their own, trying to find the magic formula to create porcelain which was as good as what you could get from China. I can't remember who did it now. Somebody worked it out eventually. I think the Jesuits.
I didn't know at all. Interesting.
Get the formula out. Yeah. But of course, those sorts of industries changed enormously with colonialism. The textile industry in India, of course, changes incredibly with British colonialism. And the Chinese porcelain industry changes in the 19th and 20th centuries. And again, to do with, the European colonial powers sort of changing the terms of world trade.
Why? What were the traits of the market at the moment?
Sorry, at the moment?
No, in that moment. What is what they tried to change?
Okay. Well, there was, in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was an effort by many of the European powers to colonize a lot of the world, of course, in Africa and in South America, and throughout Asia also. So China was never officially colonized, but they were under a lot of pressure. Obviously, the British took Hong Kong. There were wars fought, and there were extraterritorial treaties signed with various treaties up and down the coast. So they were under, let's say, enormous pressure to, adopt to the European way of trading.
Okay, so let's now change a little bit the topic. We could go to this in contemporary indigenous design, because you have been also researching on that, right?
Yes. And I think one of the key ways of thinking about decolonization has come from Indigenous scholars and Indigenous theorists and practitioners and their way of designing and way of seeing the world. And I think in an Australian context, this has become more and more important. Australia, like somewhere like the US and Canada, is a settler colony whereby settlers from primarily England first came and settled the land, displacing Indigenous people and their institutions and knowledge systems. So more recently, I guess there have been calls for designers and architects to actively engage with reconciliation processes and start to try and understand Indigenous ways of designing, building, and seeing the world.
No, I was going to ask, I understood that it's compulsory to teach Indigenous knowledge in the university in design, right? So you have been working in the integration of this knowledge to the design curriculum.
That's right, yes. I teach in both in a School of Design and Architecture. So I teach both across design and architecture. And one of the big changes that happened in 2021 was the Architectural Accreditation Board, which accredits architects all over Australia, changed their competency regulations so that if you want to be registered as an architect, you need to attain certain competencies. And the schools that are teaching architecture need to teach these competencies. And the change in 2021, the biggest changes had to do with Indigenous knowledge and incorporating ideas of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ways of understanding the landscape and the country into the curriculum and into design practice. And so, yes, we've been working, as have all design and architecture schools, on how to implement that and how to teach more Indigenous ways of knowing and thinking about our relationship to the landscape and to the planet, if you like.
You talk about Indigenous competencies. Which ones are the Indigenous competencies that you are teaching?
Oh, okay. So it's the competencies have to do with understanding the worldviews and perspectives of Indigenous Australians through things like co-design or participatory design projects, integrating those worldviews and perspectives into conceptual design projects in a respectful and appropriate way. So typically, this would involve processes that are participatory and collaborative, that is, involving Indigenous people within the design project, from the very beginning. But one of the issues, of course, is that if all the universities are trying to do this, there are not very many design professionals or architects who are Indigenous, particularly in Melbourne. And so you run up against this problem then of, well, personally, there aren't that many professionals to refer to and to collaborate with. And secondly, those few that there are presumably being asked many, many times by all the different schools to do talks and to do, to try and fill in these competencies. So it is a challenge, yes.
So did you get some kind of training for that?
There have been various training modules available, and we go on walks with Indigenous people and these sorts of things. So yes, there has been some training available. One of the other sort of challenges is that to really incorporate Indigenous knowledge and worldviews, is quite a challenging conceptual way of thinking about design and architecture. So for the most part, if I take architecture as an example, students will start with this idea of a blank slate, a cleared piece of land with nothing on it, and you build something out of that. Now, from an Indigenous perspective, there is no blank slate of land. All land is living. It contains stories. It is part of the living earth, and it's connected to us as well as humans. And so there's some fundamental differences in the way of approaching something like architecture from an Indigenous perspective, I think. How can you have respect for the earth and incorporate these sort of ideas around the ecology and around the stories that the earth might have for us?
So you have some contradictions or difficulties there, and what happened? At the end, you start building things, or you also practice some design denial, or what happens in these situations?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question. And I think this is one of the big issues with decolonizing design, that many things have been written in theory about what we should do and how we should be completely, changing the way we design and our relationship to design and to the planet. But the trouble is, of course, that, design industry and the institutions are not necessarily changing as well. And so from the institutional perspective, they're looking to tick that box. The studio might go for 12 weeks or 14 weeks or something, but is that enough time to really, do justice to these ideas and really change the way we're practicing things? I guess the short answer is you try and do what you can.
But you have some concrete examples in which you try to embody these decolonial principles, and you have done some design work or architecture work?
Yeah, there are a number of designers within Australia I could think of. Tristan Schultz is a really interesting designer, and he has written quite a bit on this idea of decolonizing design. He has a studio in the Gold Coast in Queensland, and has done a number of, I guess you'd call them, strategic design projects that focus on Indigenous placemaking, using Indigenous language and concepts and worldviews to create, things like placemaking projects for, new facilities in the area and that sort of thing.
What is the result of a placemaking project for new facilities?
I guess it involves signage and communication design, and creating signage that incorporates Indigenous language and signage that incorporates Indigenous concepts of the landscape as well, to explain to people not familiar with the landscape and how to read it. So things like signboards and that sort of thing. And also, I guess, respect in terms of how and where to build new facilities, where to put the buildings, where to put things that will have some respect for the natural environment as well.
What are the ideas that the Indigenous communities have about where to place new facilities?
Oh, okay. Well, generally in Australia, there is this concept of country, whereby all of the land is living and contains stories. So it's a question of, I guess, asking Indigenous people and working with them to work out where might be the most appropriate or not appropriate places to build, say, a new building or a tourist center or that sort of thing. That, and I guess what they may do is something like, well, if we can situate it here in relation to this mountain, which may have some great sacred significance, or in relationship to the water, or the river or creek or whatever it is, and then build around those ideas and think about, well, how can our architecture respond to the landscape and respond to these particular places.
And you have some legislation that support all of that, for example, when an architect wants to build, there is a board of indigenous community that can suggest or can debate with them how to build?
No, nothing official as such, but that is starting to become a bit more of an accepted practice, particularly on big projects in Australia. Yeah. So, yeah, if you're just building a regular house or some apartments, then no, there will generally be no such things. But if you were, say, building a large-scale government building, then maybe, yes, there would be some consultation.
It's great that there is the practice, but not need of any legislation for that, right? So there is a common understanding that this is how we should respect our indigenous communities.
It is happening slowly, very slowly. Yes. And I guess this is the role of something like the Architecture Accreditation Board, trying to embed within the profession these sorts of understandings, which I think is a really interesting move on the part of the Professional Accreditation Board to try and embed that knowledge within both education and practice.
This episode is part of the lists Decolonizar, Australia y Diseño, D&D in English, y Territorio y Diseño. The titles of the lists are in Spanish, but each list contains episodes in English. The D&D in English list includes all the episodes published in English. Over time, we've been building a solid collection, and if this is your first time listening to us, now you know there is plenty more to explore. Daniel points out that one of the big challenges he's identified is the real integration of indigenous knowledge and worldviews into university curricula. In many universities around the world, this isn't even seen as a challenge because, frankly, there hasn't been much reflection on how to decolonize design education in the first place. Most design institutions haven't taken a hard look at their own colonial practices or consider what it could mean to move beyond them. As a result, indigenous perspectives are often left out and the curriculum remains centered on Western knowledge and ways of thinking. But the truth is that by not including indigenous knowledge, we are missing out on so much, not just for indigenous students and communities, but for everyone. Indigenous knowledge systems offer valuable insights and problem-solving approaches, especially when it comes to issues like sustainability or community well-being. Integrating these perspectives can make education richer, more inclusive, and probably also more relevant to the challenges we all face today. That's why this podcast series matters. It's a way to challenge the status quo and start putting indigenous knowledge on the agenda. By opening up a space for these conversations, we are taking a step towards reimagining what design education can be. More inclusive, more just, and more connected to diverse ways of knowing. Let's continue listening to Daniel, that he has much more to tell us. were talking about your previous research work on modern Asia, but you didn't tell me what are you researching nowadays. I didn't ask you that.
Well, I was lucky enough to get a fellowship to go to the Smithsonian last year and do some research at the National Museum of American History. And what I was looking at was the history of automation in the retail industries. So things like vending machines and whether vending machines would become a viable retail alternative to shops. And I guess the short answer is no, they haven't. There's been a lot of hype around that technology for over 100 years, actually, with these sort of promises of, soon in the future, everything will be delivered by machine, which I think is sort of interesting because, we're getting similar sort of ideas today with things like AI, etc., that in the future, it's all going to be different. But things often don't work out that way. So for vending machines, of course, they still play a role and they're around in, maybe a train station or transit station or in the lobby of the hospital, but they haven't exactly taken over the way we, shop.
And what is the connection of this with all your work on decolonial design? Does it have a connection, or I am trying to pull things together that they shouldn't?
Yeah, no, there is not really any connection. I did another book which was called Designing Retail Experience, where I was looking at a more contemporary retail experience and this premise that retail stores were finished with e-commerce that starts in the early 2000s. So I was looking at how and which brands had built a lot of stores that had been very successful, like Apple and IKEA and Zara and what have you. So I guess from that project, I've sort of started going backwards into time and looking into the 20th century. But no, it's not really related to the decolonial thing at all. I have many interests.
Good. I want to come back to the decolonial. So, in your opinion, what are the strategies that would you recommend to designers seeking to decolonize their work or be more aware about the colonialism in our practices?
Yeah. Well, I think another of the challenges of this particular term, decolonization, is it does tend to become a bit of a catch-all phrase, which can mean many, many things. One thing, and I guess that's why I focused on Australian examples, is that it needs to be translated to wherever you are. So I suppose I can talk about Indigenous knowledge and coming to terms with that in Australia. That's going to mean something quite different if you're in Brazil or if you're in Canada or if you're in Europe somewhere. So that's the first issue. I guess on a broader sense, decolonization, if it's about undoing the colonial assumptions, part of that is this assumption that modern design, new technologies are neutral and are universal, appropriate for everyone, everywhere. And part of the first step, I guess, is really questioning that and questioning your position as a designer, and whether you've really considered that these things are in fact universal, and of course in most cases they're not. In terms of Indigenous knowledge systems, I think the most important thing is to ask Indigenous people and try and find out as much as you can from them. Listening is the first important step there, and dialogue. And in terms of resources, I think there are some good resources online. If people look up the manifesto for Decolonizing Design, put together by the Decolonizing Design Collective in about 2017 or 18. I can't remember. They put together this manifesto. There's the Indigenous Design Charter, which was put together by some designers and practitioners here in Australia at Deakin University. That's a really good document as well, too, if you're interested.
Perfect. Did I forget to ask you something that you would like to be asked?
I was just going to say, if you ask for recommendations, because I remembered you'd done that on previous podcasts.
Yeah.
I just got a book by an academic by the name of Yor Ofsu Asare called Decolonizing Design in Africa that I was just looking at. It sent me. And what's interesting about this book, he has done a lot of research into what design education, design practice in Africa can teach us. And he asks an interesting and I think provocative question that there can be a tendency to uplift Indigenous design as superior to Western design. And so he poses the provocative question: is the quest to, uplift Indigenous design, then putting it in a superior position to Western design, and maybe there's some dangers in that reversal of the hierarchy, I guess.
Yeah, that in a way we should think that they are just different perspectives and embrace them all.
Yes.
Like putting the question is saying that, right?
That's right. Yes. And this is part of, I guess, the other word that comes up in decolonial theory is this term pluriverse, to refer to the plurality of different perspectives, worldviews, ways of thinking, and that I guess ultimately, can we design for the pluriverse? Can we design in a way that can incorporate all of these different worldviews?
What would you recommend to a designer that is just exploring these issues of the colonial design and wants to get deep into that beside the reading? There is something in the practice that we should especially acknowledge.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because it can become very theoretical, can't it? And very abstract. And this is one of the issues. I guess it really would then, if you're looking for more practical examples, it would be a question of going out and finding them wherever you are. And I think this doesn't necessarily have to be Indigenous, in somewhere like Australia. That's maybe an easy place to look. I guess a friend of mine has been doing some research into folk cultures in Europe. And we had the interesting discussion about whether that could be considered as part of this project. That is, if decolonization is about undoing these universal ideas about modernism and everything being the same, maybe, your local folk cultures, wherever you are, and traditional cultures have something to teach us as designers. And certainly they tend to have something useful to teach us about the specificity of the place and the culture where you are, but also the relationship to the land is often a key part of a lot of folk design practices too, using local materials, engaging with local techniques, tools, ways of doing things.
And do you think that in the future you will continue working with these concepts of pluriverse and decolonization?
Yeah, I hope to. Yes, indeed. I hope to.
What are you planning?
What am I planning? Well, at the moment, I'm still working through some of these curriculum ideas, which I mentioned earlier, and how to incorporate Indigenous concepts into the curriculum of architecture and design education, which, as I said, is not an easy thing to be to be doing. But I think the broader issue that I mentioned before about folk culture and tradition is a really interesting one. And I guess I'm most interested in pursuing this idea of neither modern nor traditional. How can we get out of this binary way of thinking about design, that it's either got to be, modern and progressive and technologically focused and etc., or if it's traditional, it's somehow backwards, left in the past, and that sort of thing. So I guess I'm most interested in pursuing that question, that how can we get away from that binary way of thinking into other ways of thinking that might be more inclusive.
Thanks a lot for the interview.
Thank you.
Daniel pointed out that decolonization is often used as a catchphrase, but it can mean very different things depending on the context. For example, what decolonization looks like in Australia is not the same as in Brazil or any other country. If our design classes use content that could be taught anywhere in the world, it might be a sign that we are not encouraging our students to dig into their own roots or to truly understand the context they are living in. In many universities, this isn't even recognized as a challenge because there hasn't been much reflection on how to decolonize education or to question the colonial practices that still shape curriculum and teaching methods today. Decolonizing education is not just about adding a few diverse readings or mentioning Indigenous knowledge in passing. It's about fundamentally rethinking whose knowledge is valued and making space for local stories, perspectives, and ways of knowing. This means revising curricula, changing teaching approaches, and connecting learning to place and community so that education becomes more relevant and empowering for all students. This series is an invitation to challenge established academic practices and to start putting Indigenous knowledge and other marginalized perspectives at the center of the conversation. By doing so, we can help our students broaden their understanding of their own regions and encourage a more inclusive, reflective, and transformative approach to design education. As always, the music of this podcast is by Antonio Zimmerman, sound design is by Andy Fecci. This podcast is published with Creative Commons license with attributions. This was Diseño y Diáspora. You can follow us on social media channels in YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Blue Sky, or visit our website. Remember to recommend us and recommend our books. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.